The wind curled through the dried prairie grass like fingers through brittle hair. Dust lifted and danced in spirals across the cracked earth, whispering along a broken fence that hadn't been mended in years.
Ow.
The cabin stood alone on the rise, hunched and gray, as if it had bowed under the weight of silence and time. The sky behind it flared with blood-orange clouds, casting a dying glow across the land. Crows circled above, crying out against the hush of evening, as if warning something unseen. Inside the cabin, Caleb Mason sat hunched over a wooden table, scratched with knife marks and stained with oil and ink. He was in his 40s, though his reflection in the tin mirror aged him older. A weathered face with high cheekbones, leathered skin from sun and sorrow, and pale blue eyes that had seen too much. He hadn't spoken aloud in months, hadn't needed to. The world outside had gone on without him, and he preferred it that way. He carved solitude like stone. A tattered journal lay before him, the edges curled with years of turning. His pen scratched across the page in careful lines, not letters to the living, but to a woman long dead. Mary, the sky burned tonight, like the fire we used to watch together. I wonder if you would have liked the new colties, stubborn like you. The coyotes came close again. I sleep with my rifle by the bed. Still hear the baby crying in my dreams, even though it's been 10 winters now. Behind the cabin, too, simple wooden crosses stood in a patch of wild sage. One was taller than the other. He visited them each morning, said nothing. Just stood, hat in hand, like a soldier reporting in. The drought had made the days harder. The water barrel out front was down to a hand's width from dry. The well needed fixing. But Caleb had grown too tired of fixing things. Coyotes lingered. At the tree line, sometimes coming in close enough, he could hear their breath in the dark. One had gotten into the chicken coop a week ago. He hadn't replaced the wire. That evening he'd caught a rabbit in a snare, skinned it in silence. On the porch, hands moving like machinery. No prayer. No thanks. Just survival. He cleaned the blade, stared out across the horizon. Something felt off. The wind shifted, cold where it shouldn't be. He narrowed his eyes toward the distant ridge. The storm rolled in sudden and wrong, the sky folding inward. Lightning cracked like bones breaking. The rain came like a flood, drenching the dust until it rose like steam. Caleb stood at the doorway, rifle in one hand, the other bracing the frame. His gut twisted, then a sound. Faint. A thud. Not thunder. Not coyote. He stepped outside. At first he thought the wind had thrown a piece of fabric across his porch. But as he came closer, his boots splashing in the rising puddles, he saw skin beneath white. A figure, a woman. She lay crumpled across the steps, one bare foot curled under her. Her dress, no, not a dress. A wedding gown was soaked and torn. The veil clinging to her shoulders like wet cobwebs. Her hands trembled. Blood darkened her lip and streaked across one cheek. She lifted her head just enough to meet his eyes. Caleb dropped to one knee beside her. "Ma'am," her lips moved. He leaned closer, his hat knocked back by the wind. "He's going to kill me," she whispered. Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed fully, her body giving out in his arms. Caleb looked out into the storm. Nothing moved beyond the dark trees. But something was out there, and it was coming. He carried her inside like she weighed nothing, her soaked dress trailing rainwater across the threshold. The fire had almost died out, but the embers were warm enough. Caleb laid her down gently on the braided rug in front of the hearth, close. Enough for the heat to reach her, but far enough that he wouldn't feel her breath. He knelt beside her, not touching her yet. His fingers hovered above her face, unsure. It had been so long since he'd been near another living soul, so long since touch meant something other than survival. She shivered violently, her skin pale and clammy, dark strands of hair plastered. To her cheeks, finally he moved. He fetched a dry blanket, knelt again, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her skin was littered with bruise, center collarbone, her wrists, her throat. His jaw tightened. There was dirt under her nails, and the hem of her torn gown carried the faint, bitter smell of gunpowder. Not just a runaway, bride a hunted one. He stripped off his coat and placed it under her head. Then he sat down across the room, facing her like she might wake up swinging. The storm outside howled louder, but inside, there was only the pop of the fire and the weight of silence. She woke like a snapped wire. Her eyes flew open. She gasped, wild and frantic, scrambling to her knees. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She turned toward the door as if ready to bolt. "Easy," Caleb said, not moving. She stumbled backward until her spine hit the log wall. Her chest rose and fell like a cornered animal's. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he added. Still, she didn't speak. "Just scan the windows, the door, the knife on the counter. Where'd you come from?" he asked. "What happened?" Lips parted, cracked and bleeding, but all she said was, "He'll find me." Caleb stood slowly, poured her a tin cup of water and placed it beside her on the floor. She didn't touch it. He gestured to the hearth. "You're safe here. Now." They didn't talk after that. She didn't ask who he was, and he didn't press. She sat curled near the fire, wrapped tight in the blanket like she could vanish inside it. Caleb heated up some leftover beans and bread. She took the food with shaking hands but said nothing as she ate. Every few minutes, she glanced at the windows, flinched whenever thunder cracked. Her eyes were rimmed red not from crying but from holding it in. After dinner, Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, watching the fire. The old loneliness scratched at him. This time it wasn't hollow, it was sharp. It had a shape now, a pair of eyes that wouldn't stop searching the shadows. She hadn't told him her name. Later that night, he stood on the porch, shotgun across his chest. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet cedar and old dirt. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered out there, watching. Inside, the woman slept, curled like a question mark beside the hearth. Caleb watched her. From the doorframe, his hand tightened around the shotgun. He should send her on her way at first light. That was the smart thing. She was trouble, and he'd had enough of trouble. She might be lying, dangerous, or worse bait. He didn't owe her anything, but when he turned to go back inside, his eyes caught the graves, 2 wooden crosses, bleached by sun. The smaller one still tilted sideways from the last windstorm. He saw his wife again, plain as the night she died. Her scream had come sudden, followed by silence. He had gone out to fetch water in the blizzard, only to return and find blood on the floor. She was gone by dawn, the baby too. He had dug the graves with numb fingers, 1 shovel at a time, into the frozen ground, and now, 10 years later, another woman lay inches from death on his floor, eyes wide with fear, dressed like she'd just walked out of a funeral and into a war. He sighed. Damn it all. He stoked the fire again and tossed another log on. She stirred, but didn't wake. When he stepped back to his chair, something slipped from the folds of her gown, half hidden in the hem. Caleb crouched and picked it up. A card. No, not just a card, an invitation. Blood had soaked through the bottom edge. He squinted at the gold lettering. The union of Lawrence Bellamy and Miss June Ellen Hart, ceremony at Bellamy Estate, Bellamy. Caleb knew that name like a curse. The Bellamy Ranch was 10 miles south, a kingdom of stolen land and stolen lives. Lawrence Bellamy was rich, cruel, and surrounded by hired guns. He didn't marry for love he acquired. Caleb looked back at the woman by the fire, so she was his bride, and she ran. He held the card between his fingers until the edges curled. Then he whispered, low and grim, "What did you run from?" The next morning came quietly, gray light slipping between the cracks in the shutters. The storm had passed, but the air still held a charge like something unfinished. Caleb stood on the porch with a tin cup of coffee, watching June in the corral. She moved with silent determination, scattering feed with hands that trembled only slightly. Her dress was still wet in places, but she hadn't complained. She hadn't spoken since last night. She reached out to the mare, the one Caleb had raised since a foal. The animal flinched, then leaned into her touch like it recognized something wounded. Caleb studied her from the steps. This wasn't how most runaways moved. She didn't panic. She calculated. She'd survived something already, and she wasn't running blind. He walked to the barn. returned with a pair of boots, his wife's worn but whole. June stared at them in his hands. "They'll fit," he said, voice gruff. She didn't take them right away. Her fingers hovered over the laces. Then, almost too quiet to hear, she murmured, "My name's June." She didn't look up. Caleb didn't answer. He just nodded once, turned, and went back inside. Later, she sat by the fire, the boots beside her, her dress drying by the hearth. She touched the edge of the veil once before casting it into the flames. The fabric hissed and curled into ash. "I didn't want to marry him," she said, the words slow and scraped raw. "My father made the deal. Bellamy wanted water rights in grazing land. I was just part of the package." Caleb sat across from her, elbows on knees. "He told me I'd learn to obey," June continued. "Told me to smile, or he'd have. My sister whipped. I waited until his back was turned. Took a horse and rode through the woods while the guests were still drunk." Her voice caught. "I could still smell the wine and sweat on his jacket when I left." Caleb's jaw tensed. The name Bellamy hit a nerve. He knew the man seen what he'd done to smaller ranchers who didn't sell. Lawrence Bellamy had money. "Men and no mercy? You killed someone?" Caleb asked. "No," she said, looking him square in the eye. "But I would have if he touched me." The room held stillness again, but not the dead kind. A charged, fragile quiet that dared either of them to breathe too deep. That night, Caleb loaded extra shells into the shotgun and double-checked the locks. Something was coming. He could feel it in the shift of the wind and the way the coyotes had stopped howling. Just past midnight, the horses stirred. Caleb opened the door slow. At first, he thought the figure at the fence was Shadow. But then the figure moved, calm, precise. "Tohan," Caleb said aloud, unsure if it was real. The man nodded once, stepped forward into the lamplight. His clothes were travel-worn, dusty leather and a faded red sash across his chest. Half Comanche, lean like a blade, said little, but Caleb didn't need words to understand him. Tohan tapped the ground twice with his fingers. "They're coming?" Caleb asked. Tohan gave the smallest nod, then gestured toward the southern ridge with 2 fingers. 5 riders, no more than a day behind. He didn't say how he knew. Tohan didn't need to. The ground spoke to him. The heir to June had come to the door barefoot. The coat around her shoulders, she didn't trust Tohan. Her posture said so, but Tohan stepped forward, pulled something from the leather bag on his hip, a small wooden carving, a hawk mid-flight. He placed it gently on the porch rail. "You see danger," he said quietly. "You survive." It wasn't a promise. It was a recognition. June stared at the hawk, then at Tohan, and she nodded. They worked in silence the rest of the night. Caleb and Tohan nailed boards across the windows. June poured bullets into a tin basin, counting them one by one. "We could run," Caleb offered once. June shook her head. "I won't be a victim again." He looked at her, then not just looked, but saw. The fear hadn't left her, but something deeper had rooted inside. Rage, maybe, or something like defiance. She stood straighter now. Her hands no longer trembled. In her eyes, Caleb recognized the fire he used to carry before grief hollowed him out, and just like that, his decision settled. He'd fight beside her, no matter the cost. The sun was sinking when they came. Dust rose behind them like a storm of its own. 5 riders cutting across the ridge, the lead man in all black, sitting tall in the saddle like he owned the sky. Caleb didn't need a spyglass to know who it was. Bellamy. His presence felt louder than the thunderstorm from days before calculated. It's poisonous. Caleb stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting loose in his grip. His face was still, but inside. Something old stirred. Something that had once known how to protect, how to stand for something. Tohan moved like wind, silent and deadly, already in position behind the stacked logs near the barn. His bow was drawn, expression unreadable. Inside the cabin, June knelt near the window, her breath even, her hands wrapped tight around the rifle Caleb had taught her to use. Bellamy's voice broke across the clearing. Return what's mine, and I'll spare your worthless life." Caleb didn't answer. He just stepped down off the porch and into the dirt. Bellamy's eyes narrowed. "You've always been a ghost, Mason. This isn't your fight," Caleb spoke. Calmly, "Then you shouldn't have come to my door." Tension stretched between the two sides like rope pulled tight. Bellamy raised a gloved hand. The riders shifted in their saddles. Tohan drew back his bowstring. Caleb felt the weight of the shotgun, sweat on his brow. Inside the cabin, June's finger hovered near the trigger. The first shot rang out from the ridge. Wild and sharp, gunfire erupted in a fury. Caleb dove for cover behind the water barrel, pellets blasting splinters off the porch railing. Fired. Twice, one rider fell, screaming. Another rushed forward, but was struck down before reaching the steps. Tohan's arrows flew silent and sheared one into the throat, one into the chest. Caleb turned to see June standing in the open window. Her body shaking, but her eyes locked on a man charging the front. She pulled the trigger, like a stone. Then Bellamy broke from his horse and made a run for the cabin. He kicked in the door, glass exploding. June screamed, fought back, but Bellamy grabbed her by the arm, dragging her through the doorway like a hunter dragging prey. Caleb rose. From cover, blood dripping from a graze across his left arm. His vision blurred, but he could still see the bastard's face. He moved with steady purpose toward the porch, shotgun raised. Bellamy turned, holding June by the hair, gun in his free hand. "She's mine," he snarled. "She's property." Caleb stared down the barrel. "No, she's not." He pulled the trigger. Bellamy's chest exploded backward. He hit the dirt without a sound. For a moment, everything stopped. No shots, no shouting. It's just the wind brushing across scorched earth. Caleb dropped to one knee, the shotgun slipping from his fingers. His breath came short and tight. Then he collapsed, entirely face to the dust, his shirt blooming red. June crawled to him, hands slick with his blood, pressing against the wound, whispering his name over and over. Tohan stepped forward quietly. He looked down at Bellamy's body, then pulled a small feather from his pouch and placed it gently on the dead man's chest. What's an honor? It was closure. A death to mark, nothing more. Evening settled in slow heavy. The sun dipped behind the hills. Silence returned, but it was different this time. It was earned. Days passed. Caleb woke to warmth and light. His chest ached. His arm was bandaged. The fire crackled. Outside. He could hear the sounds of wood being split, of water being drawn, of life continuing. He sat up slowly. June was in the yard, trousers tucked into boots, her hair pulled back with a leather strap. She moved with purpose, confident, calm. She saw him through the window, and for the first time she smiled. Later that evening he wrote in his journal again, "Mary, the house is no longer empty. They're still quiet, but it's not hollow, it's soft now." She's still figuring out how to breathe in this world, but so am I. June walked past the graves at dusk. She knelt and placed wildflowers at Mary's cross. Then beside it, she pressed a new stone into the earth. It read, "New beginnings rise from old grief." The wind, for once, felt like a blessing.